Well, hello everyone. I'm Doug Woodward. Only my mother called me Douglas, but nevertheless, that's the way that I do my books, S. Douglas Woodward. If you recognize my face, you might have seen me. Occasionally I host Prophecy in the News, another ministry in Oklahoma City that has a good relationship with Southwest Radio Church and has for years, because the principles of Southwest Radio Church and Prophecy in the News all came from the same church in Lubbock, which was where Buddy Holly also was there out in Lubbock. So it's a close-knit community. So today I'm going to talk about some things that hopefully will stretch your thinking. My approach tends to be like itching powder for the brain. I like to cause you to have to rethink and challenge sort of the traditional points of view. And so I'm going to do that today. So I'm going to do this. Now, there's no right or wrong answer. Well, there is, but I know it. Doesn't it sound like Donald Trump? I'm the guy that can fix this. All right, but I'm curious, how many of you, let's just do a little survey, all right? How many of you believe that America is mentioned in the Bible, that America is actually prophesied about in the Bible? If you believe, I'll hold my hand up because I do. So, all right, so probably I'm seeing maybe 10% of you do. All right, that's good. How many of you believe that Psalm 83 is a future war yet to occur? All right, so now that's most of you. That makes sense. That's what I would think, because it's become kind of part of the traditional scenario. Okay, how many of you believe that the Antichrist is going to be a Muslim, that the Islamic Antichrist is the case? How many of you believe that? It's about 50, maybe 40%. Okay, all right, so I'm going to talk to you today about why I believe that the Antichrist is not Muslim, and why Psalm 83 is not a future war, and why America is in the Bible. Okay, so I'm a contrarian, and but I want to make sure that I tell you all that I love Bill Salas. He and I at a prophecy conference a few weeks ago sat right next to each other, and we agree on most everything, but we happen to disagree on Psalm 83. And since that's kind of his main thing, I kind of have to be quiet. But he's not here today, so I can talk more about it. And Joel Richardson and I do disagree on some things, but I consider him to be one of the best writers in the eschatological community. Isn't that a great word? I think he's a great researcher. I think he's a great Christian, but I think he's incorrect about his points of view about the Antichrist. And so my job today is to kind of give you some information about this next great war in the Middle East, why it's not Psalm 83, and why it's not Armageddon, but why it is Gog and Magog. All right? So that's where I'm going, okay? So who am I? Well, interestingly, exactly 30 years ago, I was in this room speaking. And I was speaking 30 years ago on behalf of Arthur Young, the predecessor to Ernst & Young, and I was an expert on office automation. At the young age of 32 years old, I was a national expert, and I talked about office automation. This is back in the days, most of you are like me. I generally say to people, I talk to the grays. And they go, the grays? You talk to the grays? I go, yeah, the folks that are older that like Bible prophecy and things like that. And so, but when I was 32, I was talking about office automation. And so I was an expert and talked all over the country, but this is my hometown. I'm from Oklahoma City. So anyway, so it's interesting, 30 years later, I'm older and I'm wiser. Now I don't say I'm an expert about anything. I just write and I teach, and hopefully I've written enough and taught enough that I've actually learned a few things myself. So that's kind of who I am. So I have been in business for years, and I teach at University of Oklahoma. I teach entrepreneurship. That's my day job. That's how I make tents. All right, but over the last 6 years, I've written 12 books and have been very involved in evangelical kinds of work and eschatology. So, okay. So the books I'm going to draw from are these three. These are books I've written all within the last 10 months. They are all very relevant. Even the one that's the oldest, which is the book on Russia, it's turned out that it's very relevant. Everything I talked about, I don't have to change a word of what I said 10 months ago. It's even more true today than it was 10 months ago. And tomorrow I'll talk more specifically about the threat of Russia in terms of an attack upon the United States. I'm going to talk primarily about the book in the middle, The Next Great War in the Middle East, and I'll talk a bit about mistaken identity, which is sort of a sequel. It's a drill down on the issue of the Islamic Antichrist and why it is that I believe it is not going to be that way. We'll tell you also, please take some notes because that helps you pay attention. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. There's a lot to look at on that next slide. You're doing good. I wanted to make you aware, though, I will post my slide set on my website. And there's about 70 slides. We're not going to go through them all, but they're going to be available for you to study. And I will also tell you that what I will talk about today and tomorrow is about 20% of the material in the book, The Next Great War in the Middle East. And as Larry Spargimino can tell you, I pack a lot of information into my books. And so you have to read them twice, not because they're hard to understand, but because there's so much in them. And so you will see that, I think, as we go through this. All right, so in talking about what the next great war in the Middle East is, it's really necessary to understand what you might call the anthropology of the Bible. It's where did we all come from and where did we all go? And the Bible's very clear. It says that we all are now ancestors of Noah, or excuse me, descendants of Noah, that Noah is the father of us all. And he had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, as we know. And this slide basically shows you that Ham went to the south, Japheth went to the north, and Shem stayed at home, right there in the middle. And of course, Shem and the Semites, that's really where that comes from. So let's go into the next slide. The next slide is kind of the same map, but a little bit more clear so that you can study it and look at where everyone sort of ended up. But it's important just to recap that Africa and some of Arabia was the domain of Ham, the Hamites. It's funny to read the secular books that talk about the dispersion of humanity. And they'll use these names, but they will say that, of course, Noah's a myth at the same time. But he'll still talk about the Hamites and the Shemites, and Japheth and so forth. So Shem, of course, we're very familiar with because from him and through him came the Jews and the Arabs and so forth. And then Japheth really is the family tree that most of our DNA comes from Japheth. And his is the biggest settlement. He settled virtually all over the world, Europe, Asia, and probably mostly also in North America. Long before that our teaching tells us that folks like us were in North America, chances are good that the Canaanites were actually in America perhaps 2,000 years before Jesus. Perhaps for sure 1,000 years before Jesus. So anyway, I think you'll find that interesting as you read, and I talk about that in the book. Go ahead. All right, so it's something that we don't often realize that the Hebrews, at least from some perspectives, folks talk about the Hebrews really as coming from Eber, the son of Shem, and that Eber had 2 sons, Peleg and Yoktan, all right? And it's an interesting thing to look at that verse, when the earth was divided. And a lot of us think that means that's when the continent split. Well, and it could. I'm not a young earthist, I'm a gap theorist. But it's also probable that it means when the earth was allocated, that it was allocated to the Eastern and the Western Jews. And so that is possible as well. So I have you just throw that out for you to study. There's also mention of the possibility that China is mentioned as the land of Sinim. When we hear it's mentioned in Isaiah 49, behold, there shall come from far and see, these from the north and from the west, and these from the land of Sinim. All right? When we talk sometimes about China, and we talk about the relationship, for instance, between China and Russia, it's called the Sino-Russian relationship. Well, where do you think that came from? Came from the Bible. All right? That's where they were. It's also good to keep in mind where the 12 tribes settled. And I have to go back and look at this sometimes and study it, because I tend to forget, exactly where where's the tribe of Dan. And it's kind of confusing because Dan's sort of there in the middle, and yet there's a city called Dan, which I'll talk about later, up towards the north, which is in Bashan. The bulls of Bashan, talked about in Psalm 22. All this stuff's related, fallen angels. The last days war. Is it possible that these wars of the last days are a means by which God will have Israel and the Jews repossess the lands? Could be. It's interesting that Ammon, Moab, and Edom are not part of the 12 tribes, but they are included in the prophecies of the last days. Okay? So the next war, which war is it? Is it Psalm 83? Is Psalm 83 still a yet future war? Again, Bill Salas has been the primary proponent of that and has done a great job of promoting that concept, and it has become kind of part of the standard theory. Hal Lindsey refers to it that way. David Reagan, Lion and Lamb Ministries, refers to it that way. I still challenge it. By the way, Tommy Ice challenges it as well, as you'll see. The Battle of Gog and Magog, or I should say the Battle of Armageddon, sometimes known as the Campaign for Jerusalem. The Islamic Antichrist theory believes that there is no Psalm 83 war, and it believes that Gog and Magog and the War of Armageddon are the same war, all right? And so that's why Joel Richardson would say that the next war, the next great war, is Armageddon, whereas all of us sort of standard viewpoints folks would say, well, no, it's either Psalm 83 and then Gog and Magog, or it's Gog and Magog, and then it's Armageddon. All right, so the Battle of Gog and Magog is the view that I hold. Now, let's talk about Psalm 83. I'm going to spend probably more time on this than just about anything, because this is so much a part of our thinking today, because Bill has done a great job of writing about it, teaching it. He's been on lots of TV shows, and he's a great brother. And he, like I said, he and I agree on many things: pre-trib rapture, premillennialism, all the standards. We believe in all those things, but we differ on this. All right, so these are the books that have had such an impact upon that standard view. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. All right, so is it yet a future war? Now, there are some pretty good arguments that Bill has put together, how there's this sort of inner circle of nations, then there's this outer circle of nations. The inner circle is talked about in Psalm 83. The outer circle is talked about more in the Gog and Magog war, and he believes that there is a predecessor-successor relationship. One has to happen before the other can happen, all right? I don't think that's necessarily true. He believes that it's important also because it sets up what happens in Ezekiel 38 and 39 in terms of Israel must be living securely, it must be living without walls, it must be at a time of peace. I believe none of those things are true, and I'll tell you why when we get there. But anyway, just want to forewarn you, I'm going to challenge your thinking about those things. Psalm 83, Israel represents a nation with riches, makes Gog envious, wants to come in to get booty. Psalm 83 fulfills selected prophecies of Israel destroying its enemies. This is something I disagree on with Bill, and it's something that Joel and I agree on, and I'll explain more as we go. Okay, so it's the sort of follows from the teaching of Psalm 83 that Israel, that the IDF is going to kill lots of Saudis and lots of Palestinians before they can be at peace. And so there is this prediction that there's going to be a tremendous war, and in fact, another one of our brothers, David Bay, talks about the fact that he believes in Obadiah that Israel will slaughter 1 million Palestinians. I don't think that's going to happen, not before the Lord returns. All right? But nevertheless, that is those scriptures. Go back just a second for those other scriptures. In terms of Ezekiel 25, it says, I will take vengeance on Edom by the hand of my people Israel, which it's interpreted to be the Israeli Defense Force, and they will deal with Edom in accordance with my anger and my wrath. They will know my vengeance, declares the sovereign Lord. One of the issues, this one and also the next verse that we have to study, is we have to decide, are these future prophecies, or were they future to Jeremiah or to Isaiah, but they were already fulfilled in the past? In some cases, they were fulfilled in the past. They aren't future prophecies. And in some cases, they're both. And that's why prophecy is challenging to interpret. But just remember, if we get frustrated, the disciples were with Jesus for 3.5 years. He was crucified, he was risen, and he still had to explain to them what his first coming meant. And they were like, wow, we had no idea. So prophecy in the Bible has that quality to it. It's, in other words, kind of as Yogi Berra said, I don't try to predict the future, it's too hard, I just try to understand the past. And prophecy, while we want to study it and look at what it might mean in the future, the reality is that it's understood when we look at it in the past. All right? So it's important to keep that in mind as you're looking at these verses. Now, this is part of the case for Psalm 83, is that these are the nations that are listed in the Psalms, in the Psalm 83, and it says that their objective, their goal, is to destroy the name of Israel forever. And the psalmist, Asaph, who was the choir director for David, basically, who was a seer, who did have prophetic ability, he wrote this psalm as an imprecatory psalm, meaning a psalm of cursing. He was asking God to curse all of these enemies of Israel. And the question is, did this scenario exist at the time of David, or has it never existed? Bill maintains it's never existed. Other scholars maintain no, it did exist, and it was fulfilled in the time of David, and God answered the prayer of Asaph. I'll talk more about that later. Let's go into the next slide. The real core, no, go back one more. Go back one more. You went one too fast. The real core of the challenge for whether or not Psalm 83 is in fact a future war and its relevance to us comes down to those two nations, Edom and Assyria. Who are the Edomites? Who are the Assyrians? Where did they go? All right, and we're going to talk about both of those because those are key to understanding whether or not Psalm 83 and its interpretation is correct. When Bill says the tents of Edom are the Palestinians, that is speculation. The Edomites lived in tents 3,000 years ago. And to say that because the Palestinians live in tents, that makes them Edomites, that is a non sequitur. It does not logically follow. But nevertheless, that's part of the argument. Okay, now let's go next. So let me give you kind of what the core principle is in terms of trying to understand the nature of, we might again call it sort of biblical anthropology and these prophetic principles. We think about the United States, we look at its geography, sort of the land, where is the land, and so forth. And then we look at the demographics or the nature of the people, the anthropology, sometimes it's called ethnography. But one of the challenges we have in trying to understand where we came from is we came from all over the place. Just look at that picture, all those kids from all different kind of nationalities and so forth. And I believe there's a prophecy in Jeremiah that explains what it is that's characteristic of the daughter of Babylon. The daughter of Babylon is a mingled people. And we'll look at some of those prophecies. This is a mingled people, many races that have come together. It's one of our glories, and one of the things that we have done so well as we've embraced, we are the melting pot. Give me your tired, your poor, your humbled masses yearning to be free on the Statue of Liberty. But the issue of geography versus anthropology, hermeneutic, it's a method of interpretation. So someone's hermeneutics, it's how they interpret the Bible, their methodology, their process. Okay, go ahead. All right, so something that Bill Salas and Joel Richardson agree on, if Joel was here, I'd actually like him to hear this. They actually agree on what's called the geographic correlation theory. The geographic correlation theory. Now, this sounds all technical. It's really not that hard, though, to grasp. This is what it's interesting is that Joel Richardson cites a very famous evangelical scholar, Gleason L. Archer, who wrote this in the Bible's Expositor's Commentary. Let me read this to you. Likewise, the ancient names of countries or states occupying the region where the final conflict will be carried on. Now visualize that map, Psalm 83 map, all those different nations, where they were, the names of the peoples, and how they're plotted against that map. Where the final conflict will be carried on are used in the prediction. Though most of these, or those political units, will no longer bear these names in the last days, thus Edom, Moab, Ammon, Assyria, and Babylon, which are mentioned in eschatological passages, have long since ceased to exist as political enemies, their places having been taken by later peoples occupying their territories. Okay, now, so what is he saying? He's essentially saying that Babylon was, of course, by the Euphrates River in Iraq. The geographic correlation theory would say that the future Babylon must be located in Iraq. It must be correlated. He's saying that, obviously, that Israel and the Jewish nation must be in Israel. We're good with that. But he's also saying things like, whoever lived in Turkey, Anatolia, Cappadocia, these are all names it's had through history, but Turkey is the name we use for today, the Ottoman Empire. Whoever lived in Turkey at that time doesn't matter. Whoever lives in Turkey today matters, meaning that if we identify the geography of Turkey as the realm of the Antichrist, then Turkey, whoever those people are, the Turks, the Turkmen or whatever, then they are the people of the Antichrist. Okay? You follow me? All right, so that's what it's saying. So a people can disappear, and that doesn't matter. What the prophecy of the Bible is correlating is these nations from where they used to be. I mean, they're always still in the same place, but the people that used to live there doesn't matter. It's just this location that matters. I disagree. I think that is actually at its root is a nutty theory. But it is the theory that Psalm 83 and the Islamic Antichrist is based upon. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, and so what Joel says, and I agree with Joel on this, Richardson, the Psalm 83 war theory represents a great danger to the body of Christ, because this theory holds that after the Psalm 83 confederacy is defeated, Israel as a nation will literally occupy all of the nations that now surround her. It adheres to a certain Israeli triumphalism that is simply not taught in the Scripture. So what we're saying here is that Psalm 83, the theory of Psalm 83, is really not what Psalm 83 says. It's what is inferred primarily from Ezekiel 38 and 39. And we'll talk more about that. But it's saying that if the Psalm 83 theory is correct, the Israeli Defense Force is going to conduct a war against its neighbors, and it's going to kill and decimate the armies of its neighbors. Now it hasn't it, already many times. But Israel's never been committed. Basically, Israel's position is just leave us alone. let us be in this one little space over here. That's all we want. And of course, their enemies don't want that. But nevertheless, that's been the scene that we've seen play out in our lifetimes. Okay, let's look at the next slide. All right, now Dr. Ice, who will be debating Joel tomorrow, Tommy Ice, he and I agree 100%. So I'm not by myself in what I'm saying. Dr. Ice said, my contention is that Salas, who would consider himself a futurist, and he would, has put forth a historicist interpretation. Historicist means an interpretation that prophecies already happened. Past tense, it's history. There is no real future prophecies to be fulfilled. So that's what historicism teaches. All right, so he's putting forth a historicist interpretation approach of Psalm 83 along with other exegetical errors. Solis contends that Psalm 83 teaches an Israeli war with her surrounding neighbors before the rapture takes place that will set the stage for post-rapture events like the Gog and Magog war. All right, so Tommy and I are agreeing that the rapture occurs even before the Gog and Magog war. I'm just kind of underlining that. Make a note of that. We'll come back to that. Dog-ear that slide, if you will, mentally. All right, and I believe that such a view is simply a product of Solis's fertile imagination and has no basis in the biblical text. He wrote this a number of years ago. I'm not sure if he worded it quite that way. That's a little aggressive. But nevertheless, he and Bill and Tommy have debated this, at least on one occasion that I'm familiar with. He argues that Bill is being an inconsistent futurist, that he's actually got a historicist argument. Well, he would say that about me because I happen to believe that about Daniel 11, which I won't have time to talk about, but I do talk about it in one of my books. I believe all of Daniel 11 is past tense, only the attributes of the Antichrist in verses 36 through 45 apply to the Antichrist future. So, I'm not alone in saying these things. Next slide. The geographic correlation theory. All right, Richardson says, just to point out to you that this is what Joel argues, and he and Bill are in agreement on this. The first correlation is the same general geographic location. This method identifies the location of the land or people at the time the prophecy was made, and then looks to the nation or people that inhabit this region today. So what that is then saying, as I'm drawing out the conclusions down below, the original nation migrated away. Doesn't matter. Wherever the Assyrians went, doesn't matter. Where do these people dwell now? Doesn't matter. It's not relevant. The original nation, was it destroyed? Doesn't matter. It's not relevant. New nations dwell there now, different peoples. Doesn't matter. According to the geographic correlation theory, it's just that location, and whoever happens to live in that location, that's all that Bible prophecy is talking about when it comes down to the last days. That's one of the reasons why Joel would say that we're just dealing with a regional scenario. His view is that the Islamic Antichrist reigns over the Middle East, and that it is not a global issue, it is a regional issue, all right? Now, what are my issues with this, all right? Well, first, Gog must be Turkey because Meshech and Tubal once resided there, all right? So Meshech and Tubal, this is one of the arguments I pursue. I point out, of course, that all of us were Turks at one time. Why? Noah. Because of Noah. That's where the ark landed. So when we came off the ark, we speaking sort of that way, we were all Turks. But guess what? Noah allocated the world and people spread around. In fact, by the time of Ezekiel's prophecy, people had been dispersing for 2,000 years. By the time of Ezekiel's prophecy in 550 BC, the world, Japheth in particular, had dispersed all across from the Pacific Ocean, perhaps all the way into the New World. That's how much dispersion had occurred. And so I have no problem in saying that there's more to Gog and Magog, to Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and so forth than just Turkey. All right? And I'll do more to back that up. The Assyrian references Turkey. The Assyrian is another name you see in the Old Testament for the Antichrist, right? He's sometimes called the Assyrian. Joel argues that it references Turkey because Assyria once ruled there. So now this he's flipping around. It's not really kind of consistent. He's saying, well, since the Assyrians once ruled in Turkey, then the Assyrians once again must be the people of the Antichrist. That's the argument. It's a little bit tricky to follow. Now, things we have to keep in mind, there are a lot of tricks to this. Edom and Rome, the Jews in the Talmud and so forth, other Jewish wisdom writings, they talk about Edom and they talk about Rome as their enemies. And they're not necessarily talking about Edom, as in Petra or Mount Seir, and they're not necessarily talking about Rome, as in the Italian peninsula. They're using those names sort of metaphorically to identify their enemies. And so the scripture may do that. If so, then we're dealing with somewhat of a kind of an allegorical, analogical, or symbolic issue. We're not literally talking about the Romans in Italy. We're not literally talking about the Edomites. We may be talking about them symbolically opposing the Jewish agenda or the Hebrew agenda. All right? And we also have to keep in mind that, as I said earlier, that Babylon must be Babylon on the Euphrates, because there's no symbolism allowed. It has to be geographically located there. That Judah represents all Israel, despite the fact that the scripture talks about a future regathering. So think about that. Usually, we have the current nation state of Israel comprises primarily Jews. Came from Judah, Benjamin, and so forth. It's really only about 3 tribes. 9 of the tribes, or 10 lost tribes, aren't necessarily represented there. And yet the nation state is called Israel, and we sometimes assume Israel and Jew, that's the same thing. Actually, to be biblically accurate, we need to distinguish the two. All right? So the question then is, well, what does Israel represent? Is it the Gentiles? Is it the church? Is it the lost tribes? Is it where the lost tribes migrated to? There's some tough questions. Don't mean to make it sound easy. We also have to remember, as I said, like Ezekiel 37 uses this concept of the 2 sticks. Take a stick and write on one of them, basically, Judah, write on the other, Israel, and eventually the 2 sticks will become one. A little more complicated than that, but essentially that's what it's saying. And the Lord is saying, in the end times, I will regather all of Israel, all of the lost tribes. But exactly what does the scripture mean when it says that? And I won't answer that question for you, but it's an area that we need to think about and study. And it's one that relates to this issue of the Psalm 83 Gog and Magog war, okay? So other problems. Asher is another word for Nimrod. And you see this in a lot of studies, all right? So we talk about Asher. Also, it usually is translated Assyria, but it may also mean Nimrod, right? There are lots of names for Nimrod in mythology. Certainly, Minos is one of those, and Marduk in some cases, but there are many names for Nimrod in mythology of Babylon and of the Assyrians. But I would put forth that there is an immense amount of information and documentation that says that the Assyrians aren't in Turkey, they're in Germany. That they were fair-haired, blue-eyed. They were known as a warring people. That's what the Romans called the Germani. They were people of war, and they were fierce warriors, and they were known for this. And so it puts a completely different coloring on the issue of maybe where the Antichrist comes from. Could it be that the Germans have always opposed the Jews? It's an interesting theory. But it is documented in a lot of resources. So I just throw that out there. And so it conflicts with, though, the geographic correlation theory. All right? Now, Edom. The Edomites became the Idumeans. Remember King Herod? King Herod was an Idumean. The Idumeans existed in the south of Jerusalem. This was in the time of the Maccabees and so forth. And the Edomites eventually got blended in. But one of the reasons that the Jews hated Herod was because he was a descendant of Esau. The Edomites were descendants of Esau. But over time, they got blended in. Noah Hutchings had a DVD that I hadn't seen until about 3 or 4 months ago. I watched it. And he's doing a tour of Petra. And he talks about how Petra was a great empire at one time. It was the Edomites that lived in that area of Bozrah, Aqaba, Petra, Mount Seir. And he made the statement, which I hadn't thought about, which is that Jerusalem is the #1 city mentioned in the Bible, more than any other. Number 2, what would you guess is the number 2 city mentioned more than any other city? Babylon. Number 3 is Petra. It's Mount Seir, Petra, that whole area, that stronghold of Esau, Edom, is mentioned more than any other cities except Jerusalem and Babylon, which I found to be really, really intriguing. All right, so history tells us that the Edomites were basically brought into the Jewish people, and then when they were dispersed, the diaspora, that the Idumeans were dispersed as well. But there's also historical migrations of the Edomites to Anatolia, which is another interesting story we don't have time to talk about. But the point I'm making here is, I think I say this, yeah, number 8. Some Edomites apparently migrated to Turkey. So if the Islamic Antichrist theory is correct, my argument would be, if it's correct, it's because the Turks are Edomites, not Assyrians. The Assyrians are Germans. Joel's argument is that Turkey is an Assyrian nation, and the Assyrians are the enemies of the Jews, and the Assyrian is the Antichrist. So I'm flipping things around. Why am I doing that? Because the science of anthropology tells us where these migrations actually occur, and it actually challenges the theories of Psalm 83 and the Islamic Antichrist. All right? That's where I'm going. Palestinians aren't Edomites. Palestinians never dwelt in Edom. The tents of Edom doesn't make them Palestinians. This sort of breaks the back of the Psalm 83 theory, by the way, because that's really a cornerstone of it. And why is all this relevant? Another area where Bill and Joel agree, and again, Bill's not here. Joel will have a chance to defend himself tomorrow. And I love Joel. I think Joel's a wonderful guy. I really do. He's a great Christian and a great writer. But another issue where they agree is that because Bill argues Psalm 83 has to happen next, he pushes the return of the Lord and the rapture way out into the future. Because Joel believes that Turkey is the power base of the Antichrist, he pushes the return of the Lord way off into the future as well. How far off? 2 decades, 3 decades? I think the end may be within the next few years. And as we talk more about America's place in Bible prophecy and so forth, and the Gog and Magog war, the scenario I put together, I believe it could happen in a handful of years. So I think that's its practical importance. Okay, next. All right, so I argue Psalm 83 is not a future war. This is the research of Chris White. He did a little 19-minute video called Debunking Psalm 83. It's very, very good. I don't have time to go through it other than to say that his main argument is that the Scripture tells us that the events that are referenced in Psalm 83 have already happened. They're documented in the Old Testament. If you study the book of, I think it's 2 Kings and so forth, you'll see where the Assyrians did go to Gibal to check out trade routes. They were involved, and that ultimately the reason that Psalm 83 is not a future war is that God answered Asaph's prayer, and David was triumphant over his enemies, as we know. Why? Because even his son Solomon extended his empire even further. Next slide. The critical passage to analyze, and I got to get my phone out here so I can check my time. Let's see, I can look, actually I can see it right there, 11:39. The critical passage to analyze, and this is something that is, I'm either really right or I'm really wrong, all right? And so just be warned. Now, I happen to have a number of scholars that agree with me, but they admit that this insight that I've brought forward is different, all right? So be warned. All right, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. It might be that I actually have had a new insight. All right, Ezekiel 38, 10 through 12. I argue this passage is critical to Bill's argument on Psalm 83. That the reason Bill argues what he argues is because he interprets Israel as the land of unwalled villages. All right, where do I get that? Certainly the context of Ezekiel 38, 1 through 9, there's no question we're dealing about Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, we're talking about Gog, we're talking about perhaps the Rush, perhaps Russia is, in effect, the prince of Meshach and Tubal. I'll talk more about that. All right? But even though the flow of that passage is dealing with Israel gathered together on the mountains of Israel, something happens in the middle of this chapter. I argue it's a parenthetical statement. It's like Ezekiel's been talking about Israel and all the things that are going to happen in Israel in the very last days, and then he stops. And then he talks about something else. And this is really interesting, I think. He says, "Thus saith the Lord God, oh, it shall also come to pass that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought." Well, prior to this, Gog has been thinking an evil thought about going up against Israel and destroying Israel. But at the same time, he shall have another evil thought. "And thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, having neither bars nor gates, to take a spoil, to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods, that dwell in the midst of the land." Historically, everyone has thought this refers to Israel, except very, very few. The problem is that if you don't deal with the passages that talk about the daughter of Babylon, who it is, and how it's destroyed, you're going to just assume this is Israel. I argue this is the United States, England, and Saudi Arabia. All right, so hopefully that's really making, you talk about itching powder for your brain. Hopefully that's really making you think now. All right, now why would I say that? Let's go on. Let's look at the next slide. Who are the parties that are named in this prophecy? Sheba and Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? The standard view from Hal Lindsey forward, probably even going back to Schofield and before that, is that Gog and Magog are coming to take a spoil. They're coming to take advantage of the fact that Israel is secure. Israel has no enemies. Israel is living in peace. It has no bars, no gates. Israel is a rich nation. It has lots of cattle and goods. It has silver and gold, right? That is the premise of Psalm 83, of that teaching, is that that's the characteristics of Israel. But are we dealing with Sheba and Dedan, merchants of Tarshish, and the young lions? Are we dealing with them the right way? Clearly they're astonished. That's what this says. But are they astonished because Gog is attacking Israel? Or are they astonished because Gog is attacking them? Let's go to the next slide. Now, Sheba and Dedan, geographic correlation theory works pretty well because the people are still there, they're in the same land. If you look at all of the names that are talked about in Genesis 10, the table of nations, you chart that out with all the names that are located on the atlases, right? That's still very true. Yemen is Teman, and so forth. Sheba and Dedan, cities in Saudi Arabia. So there's almost nobody challenges that Sheba and Dedan refers to the peninsula, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Arabic nations in that area. Okay, next slide. Now, what the real trick is who are the merchants of Tarshish and who are the young lions. And again, I'll only have time to touch on this a little bit, but this is one of the major changes that myself, my co-authors, and others that agree with me have been promoting in the last few years, is that the merchants of Tarshish come from Sidon and Tyre and Sidon, which were the Canaanites, also known as the Phoenicians, and they continued to migrate from Lebanon to the west. They founded Carthage in northern Africa, in Tunisia. Remember Hannibal? and where Hannibal was fighting against the Romans in the 4th century, or is it 5th century BC, almost defeated Rome. The only way Rome finally defeated the Carthaginians was they decided they had to take the battle to Carthage. And they defeated the Carthaginians because it forced Hannibal to come back from the Italian peninsula, where he'd been warring with the Romans for like 11 years and was defeating them every time. Every time. So went back to Carthage. And so the Romans defeated him. Hannibal eventually became a counselor to Antiochus Epiphanes III. The fourth we know of because of the Maccabees. But there's a connection between Hannibal and the Seleucids in the what we would call today Syria or Jordan. And those were, of course, those, it turns out the Seleucids, and if we ever wonder why it was that Herod got along so well with those people, it's because they actually were all relatives to the Romans. So there's an awful lot of intermarriage that was going on there. So there's a whole lot of history that tells us why things were set up the way they were when Jesus was born. But essentially, as this map shows, the Canaanites, by the way, the word Canaan means merchant. The Canaanites founded Tyre and Sidon. Those nations, you see those names mentioned. One of the interesting places you see it mentioned is in Ezekiel 28. The king of Tyre and the prince of Tyre. Who is the prince of Tyre? Satan. It's a story that begins with the king of Tyre and it moves to the prince of Tyre. And you see Tarshish mentioned in the Old Testament frequently, and they're always looked at by God and his prophets as evil. They're merchants. They are merchants all across the world, even in that time. It's theorized by some that Solomon had a major fleet. He combined his fleets with the Canaanites, his cousins, and together they were already mining metals in the New World. There's some arguments that the bronze from the Bronze Age, which was hundreds of years before Jesus, was composed of tin from England and copper from Michigan. And the bronze was actually put together, combining those metals and creating the bronze of the Bronze Age hundreds and hundreds of years before Christ. There's all kinds of markers in the United States that the merchants of Tarshish were in America a millennium before Jesus was born. I talk about these things a great deal in these three books. PowerQuest books are a bit more technical, and I get more into some of the details about the history of America, spiritual history and so forth. The book, The Final Babylon, has been one of the better selling books in prophecy over the last few years, and it deals with this issue of America and Bible prophecy specifically. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, are the young lions America? All right, the lion cubs. You can see there's a lion cub, and oh yeah, that's Tommy down there, by the way. There's the cub, and then there's Tommy Eyes. So, okay, I just wanted to point that out, that wasn't Tommy up there. That's Tommy down here. So, are the young lions America? Tommy thinks they are. Tommy's very wise. He says, perhaps the strongest case for American Bible prophecy can be made from a statement found in Ezekiel 38:13, what we just read. Young lions are often used in the scripture to refer to generic rulers or energetic rulers. Therefore, it's kind of like the Young Turks. Therefore, the young lions who verbally oppose God's invasion are strong military and political leaders who act with Tarshish, all right? That's what Mark Hitchcock said. Stuart McBurney said, we can now say with definite assurance that the merchants of Tarshish and the young lions, the colonies thereof, must include the western nations of Europe and the Americans, particularly the United States. So, the young lions of Tarshish would definitely refer to the North American colonies as well as the European colonies, and hence bring the U.S. into this prophecy. That's David Allen Lewis that said that. So I've got these quotes just to show you that I'm not crazy, that there's other Bible scholars that have been saying for quite some time that America is in Bible prophecy. Let's go to the next slide. Capturing booty. So one of Bill's premises is that Israel lives in a time of great security with no walls, and that there's lots of booty for them to capture. Well, you have to keep in mind What is the state of Saudi Arabia? What is the connection between Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and its young lions? Well, there's a very significant relationship, and it's amazing that the prophet 2,500 years ago picked out these three nations, put them all in the same verse, and tied it to what I believe is one of the last wars before Christ returns. There are, between the UK, the English, and the Saudis, more than 200 joint ventures worth $17.5 billion, and some 30,000 British nationals are living and working in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the United Kingdom's primary trading partner in the Middle East. That's a picture of a Harrods store. Anybody ever go to London to shop in Harrods? That's Harrods. It's owned by the Saudis. Has been for 2 decades, I think. February 2014, the British defense firm BAE agreed to a deal to supply the Saudis with 72 Typhoon fighter jets worth $7 billion. Okay, so strong relationship between England, which again, Bill would agree with me on this, that England is most likely Tarshish, but it's really a combination, as I showed in that other slide with the map of Spain and Tartessos in Spain, that it was probably a polity, a kind of a political union between Spain, France, and England that was occurring at the time of when Tarshish was in its heyday. Do you all remember, of course, the prophet Jonah? Jonah was told to go talk to the Assyrians at Nineveh. Does anybody know where Jonah went? What he was trying to do? How he was trying to escape? He was trying to get on a ship to Tarshish, which is basically saying, Assyria is this way, I want to go get on a ship over here. I can walk 3 days and get to Nineveh, or I can get on a ship over here and I can go to the outermost reaches of the known world, which is England. And that's what Jonah was trying to do. But God had a different plan in mind. The relationship between the United States and the Saudis. The petrodollar. If you think about it, the United States, England, that's now broken away from the EU, by the way, which is very significant, and the Saudis, those three nations, basically, are the backbone of the world's financial system. I believe that we still will have a mark of the beast and a new financial system, one world currency and all that, but today, that one world currency is the petrodollar. Nixon took us off of the gold standard in 1971. Oil became the commodity that would back money, and it has been that way. Anytime anyone goes to challenge that, the United States goes to war with them. The United States goes to war with Iraq. They were trying to get it to where they could use European euros, basically, to buy oil. Gaddafi had in mind creating a dinar, a Libyan or African dinar, backed on gold. Time to take him out. In other words, there is an economic axis of evil, if you will, and it's Anglo-American, supported by the Saudis. Those three nations are all in that one verse in Ezekiel 38:13. I thought this picture, I brought this to you, I found this as a fascinating picture of the one of the founders of the House of Saud talking to FDR. This was right after the Yalta agreement at the end of World War II, or towards the end of World War II. So we've been friends with the Saudis for a long time. Boy, oh boy, there is a lot of history to study there for the last 100 years and how oil has been behind virtually. It was behind World War I, it was behind World War II. It's a big, big part of the story of the world. Fox News, I'll just go back just for a second more to the last slide. Yeah, Fox News, big part of it now is owned by the Saudis. Glenn Beck left. Well, he was saying nasty things about the Saudis, so he had to be thrown away. That's the Chrysler building. It's 90% owned by Abu Dhabi. So, next slide. The U.S. and the relationship with the Saudis is more stressed now. You've heard about, this was on 60 Minutes a couple of months ago, the 28 pages that were not made public from the 911 Commission report. Do we know why? Because it incriminates the Saudis. The Saudis were very involved in planning and executing the 911 attack. And so if those pages come out, I heard Bob Graham and some other senators and congressmen talking about this on 60 Minutes. So this is becoming mainline. This isn't conspiracy stuff. But the government is keeping it under lock and key still, because it could damage the relationship with the Saudis. All the people from 911 that want to sue the Saudis and their reaction, sitting on top of dynamite. This could absolutely undo the world economic system. So it's a very big deal. Next slide. Now, you talk about a spaghetti mess. What this chart is, and you'll want to look at it carefully when you get the slide deck, you download it. This is the people that loan money, they're all across the top, and the people that take those loans, they're across the bottom. Now, I'll just point out a couple of things. At the top, the people that loan money are primarily the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, Canada, a little bit of Germany. So they're all basically the sort of the Western nations. So and you have China and you have Japan. China and Japan constitute about 20% of the money that's lent out in the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so forth. 80% comes predominantly from Anglo-American and the French, but essentially Anglo-American monetary sources. What's interesting is that who borrows that money? Well, over almost 60% of it is borrowed by the United States and the United Kingdom. They're called U.S. Treasury bonds, right? And that's how we finance. The rest of the world finances America and the UK predominantly because we provide the police force for the world. That's the New World Order. That's the regime. That's the issue. I'm going to go about another 10 minutes if that's okay. All right, so that's what this chart is. All right, go on. So what happens if the petrodollar crashes? Foreign nations would send a flood of US dollars back to the US in exchange for the new currency needed for oil, whatever that is. The Federal Reserve would lose their ability to print more dollars to solve America's economic problems. An immediate and dramatic increase in interest rates to reduce America's money supply. Hyperinflation would ensue temporarily while the interest rates took time to take full effect. All oil-related prices, including gas, would reach very high levels. If the petrodollar goes down, the world economy goes down. That's why it's such a challenge. Israel, is it an unwalled village? Not exactly. 417 miles. Oh, back to the other slide. Go back to the other slide just for a second, just to make a point. If you talk about taking great booty, if you're Gog, if you're a member of BRICS, who are the BRICS? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. The BRICS together owe the IMF, the World Bank, they owe under, but not far under, $2 trillion. Whatever booty Israel has is not very much compared to $2 trillion. And how do you get that $2 trillion back? You rob the bank, or in this case, you blow them up. So the theory that I'm putting forth is that Russia will attack the city of London and New York City at some point in time, take the banks out, all the debt goes away. When that happens, obviously the world is in chaos, and then what is that going to mean for Christians? Well, I think we have an answer for that. We'll get to that eventually. Keep you in suspense. All right, so the booty that Gog would get by going after the merchants of Tarshish and the young lions would far exceed what it would get from whatever oil Israel discovers. And can we actually see the Persians, known as the Iranians, wanting to attack the Saudis? Is there any reason to think that that might happen? Yeah, if you listen to the news, the Shia hate the Sunni. What's really interesting, we'll talk more about it, is the relationship between Turkey and Iran. Okay, so is Israel described or the U.S.? I would argue that all those points apply more to the United States than they apply to Israel today, at this time. The merchants of Tarshish, young lions, Sheba and Dedan, just think about this again. They're astonished. Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? If you're Russia and you are wanting to combine and confederate all of the Arab nations, what do you need to do first before you can take out Israel? You got to take out the U.S. That enters into the whole discussion of Jeremiah 50 and 51. Let's move on. So, I argue that Psalm 83 is not the next war for the reasons I've just talked about. It is, I think, a prophetic psalm in the sense that it says that Israel will always be surrounded by its enemies until the Messiah comes. Israel is not the land of unwalled villages, and yet both of these other theories assume that it is. So all these issues that, well, you know, Israel must be secured, it must have booty and so forth, all those I think begin to pass away. To consider the fact, we'll go ahead and go back, to consider the fact that both Israel, or either Israel or Turkey, could be empires in the world, which is really what Psalm 83 assumes, that Israel becomes an empire. The Islamic Antichrist theory assumes that Turkey becomes a great empire. How do they become empires if the United States and Russia still exist? Very difficult. They're going to be very influential in what happens. All right, next slide. All right, so I'll jump in and talk just for a few minutes about specifically about whether Armageddon is next. All right, so these are, of course, Joel's books along with Walid Shubat. Their view, Armageddon is the next war. Psalm 83 doesn't happen, and Gog and Magog and Armageddon are the same war. So that's their view, that it's the next war. They view that Gog and Antichrist are the same personage, that there's two kings in Daniel, a north and south kingdom, and the Daniel 11 chapter is very important to the Islamic Antichrist theory. Very important when you study it and what their interpretation is. It's a bit dated, though, because the view originally put out back in 2006 and 7 in God's War on Terror was that the king of the north was Turkey and the king of the south was Egypt. It's not as much a relevant consideration. Maybe Turkey, but Egypt is not really in the game right now. So it's already suffering, I think, from that connection. The Assyrian, they believe, is Antichrist, and so he's Islamic and likely a Turk because of that geographic correlation that's where they assume that the Assyrians, since they own part of Turkey, must be the Turks that are the power base of the Antichrist. And let's see what else. The Ottoman Empire. They also argue that the Ottoman Empire, not the Roman Empire, is the fourth empire in Daniel chapter 7. That the empire that crushes all of the other empires is the Ottoman Empire, not the Roman Empire. And so there's quite a few arguments about why the Ottoman Empire is far worse than Rome in terms of what it does, that Rome gave us some good things, Greco-Roman culture and so forth, and the Ottoman Empire and the Islamic faith, religion, gives us lots of bad things. So, you know, it may be hard to argue against that, but that's why they say that Rome is not really mentioned in Daniel 7, which I think is an interesting point of view. And they believe that Mecca is Mystery Babylon. So that's the Islamic Antichrist theory. Move on, let's see what we've got time. So the real question is, will Turkey rule the roost? Will Turkey rule the roost or not? So I think I'm out of time. I've got more slides. I could talk more, but I'll just have to stop right there and let you all look at those slides on your own, and then I'll talk more tomorrow about the actual war itself in T-10 and counting. So, Dr. Glaze, I'm done. Thank you.